Hello, I'm Pat Dennis, and you're listening to Creative Elk. And last night I watched The Invitation from 2022, which I had never heard of until it appeared on the binge horror listing. And as I usually do, I just dove into it rather, with no research and no reading of the blurb or anything. It just said it was a horror movie that I hadn't seen, so I sat down to watch it. And it was perfectly fine. I assumed it was a straight-to-streaming film, so it's that level of quality. Apparently it did get a theatrical release in America, but I don't think it ever made it to Australia in the cinema. And by the sounds of it, it was a bit of a flop. People apparently hated it, which I think is a bit too harsh. It's a perfectly fine film if you're expecting a streaming movie, but if you did go in expecting it to be like a, Blumhouse level, A24 level, or Conjuring franchise quality film, it's not going to meet that expectations. But as far as it being just a streaming movie, it's perfectly fine. Since it does appear that it's not very well known, I'll briefly explain the plot, and I'm not avoiding spoilers, so tune out if you don't want to hear them. But essentially, a young girl, Evie, living in America with no family. Recently, her mother died, does one of those DNA tests, and finds out that she's related to rich English people, lords and whatnot. And they get in touch with her, invite her to England for a family wedding. She goes, she starts to swoon over the lord of the manor, who it's specifically explained to us that he's not related to her, which I thought was funny. They go, it's not English-style incest like the royalty does. No, they're not related. Don't worry about that. It felt like, TMNT, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles' next mutation, where they introduced the female Ninja Turtle and took a 5-minute break to specifically explain for the first time ever that the turtles aren't actually related and that they're brothers in spirit rather than blood, so it's okay that they're all crushing on this other turtle. It felt a lot like that, which I got a chuckle out of. But anyway, she starts swooning over the lord of the manor. He starts romancing her, and then, as it turns out, they're all vampires, and they want her to join the vampire coven of 3 brides to Dracula, and she has to escape. And it's a basic bare bone plot of a film. It's not Inception level of depth. And that's fine. It doesn't need to be. Not all films need to be overly complicated. Some can just be a linear, basic story, and that's perfectly okay. It was a bit of a mixing of genres, which I always enjoy. I like it when you take two things and sort of slam them together. And this felt very much like a romantic comedy for the first really hour of the film. At least the first half of it was just a straight up rom-com with very light splattering of elements of horror. It was the classic woman who is not living her best and most financially stable life and is not entirely happy, gets invited to a different country where she's suddenly exposed to rich and noble people of a different quality of life. It felt like I was watching Princess Switch or The Christmas Night or the bakery one. I only watch Christmas romantic comedies, so that's all my frame of reference for that entire genre of film. But it very much felt like a romantic comedy for the first at least half of the movie, which I can understand why that would have thrown off a lot of horror fans. I'm from the perhaps privileged viewer position of also enjoying romantic comedies, but if you don't enjoy that genre and all of its tropes, you probably would have been pretty thrown off by her very tropey first half of the film, where Evie, the protagonist, is swooning over the lord of the manor that she's been invited to, and each night she's calling her friend back in America, talking about how it's going and the boy she's into, which I think I literally remember having seen happen in at least one Christmas romantic comedy. I think it's the baking one. I'm going to Google what that might be. I just got back from Googling Christmas bakery movie, and it came up with about 1,000 results, and I'd seen at least 10 of them on the first result page, so I might be combining about 10 different films in my mind, but I digress. It very much, for the first half of the film at least, felt like a very tropey romantic comedy. So if you're going to go into it, be fair warned that is really the cinematic vibe of it. It has to be on purpose because it is just full of tropes. You have her bringing her American ideals to the English old money sensibilities. She's treating the wait staff like human beings, much to the chagrin of the old lords and to the surprise of the wait staff. And it's definitely steeped in that trope feel on purpose. And I think it's a good move because it really heightens the switch of genre when the vampire stuff suddenly starts. It's a lot like From Dusk Till Dawn, where it starts off as one thing and then suddenly it's another thing. But I think unlike From Dusk to Dawn, they could have probably played their cards closer to the chest. I think the switch of genre would have been more impactful if they hadn't of spattered other horror elements through the romantic comedy half of the film. She's seeing things in the windows when she's going for a jog outside, and the maid staff are getting killed off, which you're witnessing from a third person perspective that's not being driven by the main character. So that really didn't need to be put in there at all. And her bride sister-in-laws also do a little prank on her, which I think it almost felt like none of those elements were perhaps in the original cut of the film. And after a first screening, the entirely romantic comedy first half of the film with zero horror elements was not well received, and maybe they got cold feet and started editing in horror bits retrospectively to keep people interested until the switch. And that, if that's the case, that's a shame, because I think it would have been more powerful if it was just a hard switch, and the first time there was any horror element in the film was the hour mark, where suddenly the butler slits the maid's throat and they all start drinking their blood. I think that would have been way more impactful if there hadn't been a lot of tiny little morsels of horror spattered throughout. But I get why they didn't do that. It's hard to commit to something that is going to turn off most of the audience. But on the other hand, it would have been more powerful. I thought that the main horror element throughout the film was kind of a strange choice, from the fact that the characters within the film made that choice. Because what's happening is the wait staff is being fed to the vampires that are, running the household. And I can see how that's like a analogy. It's metaphorically the rich feeding on the poor. I get that it's a class commentary. But on the other hand, it also means that this household is just going through wait staff at an extreme speed. If they're eating 1 to 2 maids a week, are they just constantly posting job listings? Why is anyone still applying to this place? It would have made more sense if they were just kidnapping people from the town nearby, which appear to be all aware that there are vampires living in the castle. And if everyone in that town's aware of the vampires and seem to be in support of them, how far are they posting these job listings? I was just thinking about that the whole time. You can't eat 4 maids a day and still have maids after a month of this diet. Do they just keep buying new maid outfits, or are they getting one maid to bleach the blood out of all of the soiled maid outfits from the ones getting murdered, and resize them and resew the holes in them? It just seemed odd. Or perhaps the postings are, looking for a maid short-time work only, preferably no family or friends that'll come looking for them. Please bring your own maid outfit and have a low garlic diet. Speaking of garlic, the vampire lore in the film was actually kind of well done and interesting. They make a specific point to say that they're not allergic to sunlight, and that's just a common misconception, which is actually fairly true in vampire lore in general. The first appearance of vampires being allergic to sunlight, so far as I'm aware, is the black and white movie Nosferatu. And though that's based on Dracula, in the novel, Dracula is never mentioned to be allergic to sunlight. And then I think the misconception was further cemented by that piece of lore being repeated again in Christopher Lee's Dracula, where that's how Peter Cushing takes him down, much like they did in, again, Nosferatu, but not the original novel. So it's all sort of a feedback loop when it comes to vampire lore. One thing will add it that was never in the original piece, and then another adaptation will come out supposedly being an adaptation from the original, but then will again take pieces of lore from previous adaptations that can't be found in the original text. So that was interesting. And it's pretty heavily implied that the lead vampire is Dracula. I don't know if they ever come out and directly say it, but they at least mention other names that have been used for Dracula, Nosferatu, Son of the Dragon, and whatnot. And one of his vampire brides is Lucy, which is, of course, turned by him in Dracula. The house he's living in is New Carfax Abbey, which is also a reference to the Dracula novel. And you even see the Harkers in the film as old people living in the town nearby who are now subservient to Dracula. They turn over Evie to him when she comes to them looking for help. So in my headcanon, I was imagining that this is like a sequel to Dracula if Dracula had won in that novel. Instead of him being driven from London and killed, he just managed to keep control of Lucy and didn't die, and has just continued to rise in power, and the town around him has fallen into disrepair and subservitude. So that was my headcanon there. They don't say it in the film, but that's what I was imagining. As far as where I would rate it alongside other Dracula movies and other vampire movies in general, I definitely wouldn't say it's the best one ever made. It's probably not even in the top 10, but it's by far not the worst. I would rate it among probably some of the more offbeat Hammer horror vampire films. Like, not any of the really big ones featuring actually Dracula, starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, but some of the smaller but still memorable ones, like The Vampire Lovers. That it's not by far a classic, but it's still an enjoyable film. And ending on a tangent, I also had to say that I found it really funny that the mean and very stern butler was played by the same actor who played Alfred in Gotham. And in that series, he's also a mean and very stern, no-nonsense butler. And it literally felt like it was the exact same character. He's dressed the same, he talks the same, he's got the same mannerisms. And it just felt like, for some inexplicable reason, Alfred from Batman was just in this film. I kept on wondering when little Bruce Wayne would show up. So I guess this actor's been typecast as mean and very strict butlers, which is a very specific and somewhat charming thing to be typecast as. I mean, I can understand why he would be playing that role. He does it very well. But that is literally all of my thoughts on The Invitation from 2022. If you're already paying for the streaming service it's on, you might as well watch it. It's a perfectly fine horror movie if you're having a little bit of a marathon. And with that said, thanks for listening. I am Pat Dennis, and you've been tuned into Creative Elk.